so they can at least hear this and hear the speaker. And then I'm going to share this with you again. And no, I don't want to stop the recording. I want to share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, so we'll finish our way through this. And remember, you're going to use these theories for various tests, of course, in your service learning paper eventually, in a number of different places. A lot of these I know are familiar, and in fact, some of you guys who have another class with me, we talked about a lot of these the other day, but not all of them. And especially as we get towards the end, there's some that are more unique to the study of violence than they are specifically crime, so they're not typically included in criminology classes. Oh shoot, I know what I was going to mention to you guys though before I dive into this. I don't know if everyone saw this, but there's a new kind of whistleblower scandal emerging about nasty things happening in ICE facilities. So there's been all sorts of issues with the ICE facilities for a while now of separating families from their children and treatment of people, whatever. So it's all been kind of like ongoing for the last couple years. But now a whistleblower just told the Department of Homeland Security that women were being forced to have hysterectomies, women in these immigration facilities, which is deeply disturbing, I hope, to everybody, because anyone being forced to like not have reproductive organs is just disgusting. But it's also reminiscent of US past. I know a lot of you guys are familiar, but maybe not everyone, with the US eugenics movement from the 1900s, 1920s, where the United States forced or coerced women to be have to be sterilized, to have the reproductive organs removed, with the idea that they wouldn't be able to then reproduce and create feeble-minded humans, aka people who weren't very smart, who were supposed to be criminal, right? So that was actually an early slide that we didn't spend a lot of time on because the whole idea is totally discredited, but this is like sort of deeply reminiscent of it, and it's really disturbing. I mean, they've not proven it yet. This whistleblower has made the allegation, and they're going to investigate and see, you know, if there's anything to it. But I just figured in a class about violence, it is certainly worth us knowing, if we didn't already know, that that is a thing. Disgusting thing, but a thing. Okay, so aside. So labeling theories are what they sound like they are. They're just basically the idea that once somebody gets a negative label, they may then just sort of take that on as their status. So it's called their master status. Or if you've taken sociology, you've probably heard that term. Master status just means like your like kind of primary identity. The idea is sort of like, oh, if everybody already thinks I'm bad, like why would I not go ahead and just do those things they think I'm doing? Because they're already accusing me of it anyway. And so you just kind of develop this identity as somebody who's bad or not worthy, as a criminal, etc. And the labeling can come from a lot of places. Ideally, and oftentimes it's from authorities, right? You're labeled a delinquent or you're labeled a felon, and then those labels stick with you. But even before that, it can come from your family, who like tells you you're no good. It can come from school authorities who are like, oh, you're trouble. It can even come from your peers, things like that. And so the label can even start before there's any kind of traditional involvement with juvenile or criminal justice. There's a old article, possibly people have read it in some sociology classes, called The Saints and the Roughnecks. And it basically goes through this idea where this researcher was looking at a community. There's two groups of young men, both of whom were doing just very mildly delinquent stuff. Nothing really violent, occasional like little fights or whatever, but more just like pickpocketing and drinking and like, you know, deviant, but not like major stuff. But one of the groups was like middle and upper class. He called them the Saints, and the other group were lower class, largely Hispanic youth. And what the researcher observed is that even though they were doing the same basic behaviors, the roughnecks, as he called them, the largely Hispanic group, didn't get a pass ever. Like school authorities were like, oh, you're bad, you're gonna be in trouble. Everybody was like on them until they took on sort of this deviant identity, whereas the Saints were like never treated in that way. And in fact, police would often say, oh, you're a good kid, you know, just go on and don't do it again. And so it was like the idea that the way the society responds to people's offending can actually make the offending worse or better, depending, you know, again, on whether people identify with that label. So pretty simple, I think, in terms of it. It's kind of like what it sounds like it would be. The problem with that is, of course, we know all kinds of people, maybe even people in this classroom, who've had some kind of negative label at some point, but instead of accepting it as their identity, they work really hard to reject it. You know, I'll prove you wrong kind of thing. So how do we know which ones are which? Who's going to decide to take on the label versus who's not? It's not totally clear in the theory. Others argue too that by focusing on who does the labeling, we're minimizing the fact that these people actually did do something wrong in many cases, right? So, okay, you got a negative label and that probably does suck, but you actually in most cases did do a thing, you know, so are we minimizing their accountability by focusing on the societal part? You know, maybe is it like too societal? And the other question, of course, is can we create kind of a system of juvenile or criminal justice that avoids labels? There are some efforts to do so, and we'll look at a little bit of them later. Probably you've heard at some point of restorative justice, which attempts to do this at least to some degree, but it's not, within the current criminal justice system, it's not something we do well, right? Honestly, we seem like we love to label people. You're a felon, you're an ex-con, you're this, you're that. And so it's not the way we've done traditionally criminal justice, which would mean a pretty dramatic shift if we thought labeling theory was really like the answer. Okay, and again, if I go too fast or if you have questions, please let me know. So of course, then if we did think labeling theory is correct, we could try to do things that were less stigmatizing. You know, we could try to teach people, like I just mentioned, restorative justice or other ways of dealing with like even like negative school behavior without giving kids a label as bad. And that would probably involve things like conflict resolution and de-escalation training and things that would just kind of dramatically shift how like both informal and formal institutions operate. And there is some of that going on right now. I mean, I was just listening, actually, the PJSA's session yesterday was a panel of people from Vermont who had worked on some police reform stuff there. And one piece they were talking about is analyzing data that they found in their state about race and police stops. And they were disturbed by the fact that they found a disproportionate amount of people who were stopped by police were Black people, and especially in a state that doesn't have a very sizable Black population at all. And so they took that data and tried to say, okay, we've got some, they didn't use this word, but some labeling effects that are happening here and some racial profiling, and how do we change the way we operate to get rid of that, to be more fair, to be more just, and therefore have a better police relationship. So it kind of built on this theory, even though they didn't actually say it. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the, is there a question, or I think it's just maybe somebody's mic background? Okay, let me know if there is. So most of you guys are familiar with the radical or conflict theory. Again, if you've ever had crim theory, you've had it. And if you've had sociology, you've heard of this for sure. So this is the, sorry, moving my ice bags. This is the idea derived from Karl Marx's critique of capitalism. So as you probably know, Karl Marx was a German philosopher, right? So he was sitting in his little armchair philosophizing largely about capitalism, in particular US capitalism. And so that's kind of important because some people say he's full of bunk. How does he even know? He's just a philosopher. He wasn't even here. But that being said, his idea was that in a capitalist country like the US, there's really two classes: the bourgeoisie, which he called the ruling or owning class, and he argued they control the means of production. Basically, they control stuff, and in particular, economic stuff, right? They own corporations and production and things, but they also tend to be the same group that owns or controls politics and all our major institutions. They are what, maybe if you think about the words of the terms of the last couple of years, they're like the 1%, right? The proletariat, the other group, he argues, are more like the 99%. They're people like the masses, like most of us, I would assume, certainly me, who don't really have any major power or control. You know, it's not like we may be like totally like unemployed or, you know, on the street or whatever, but we're not necessarily powerful people. He called that alienated laborers. And so we don't have as much control or influence. So the idea that Marx argued is that there will always be tensions or conflicts because the proletariat would like more than what it has, financially, power-wise, etc. And the bourgeoisie likes the way things are, so they want to maintain that status quo. And Marx argued, so we basically in capitalism have a system built on greed, where the powerful can get more, and the less powerful just want to get that more. They're told that's the right way to live, that's what you should have, whatever. So Marx actually wasn't really talking about crime at all. He was, again, talking more about economics and politics. But people have interpreted his work to talk about crime. And so they've argued that, you know, since the bourgeoisie have power and influence, they use law enforcement in the criminal justice system to help maintain their status, right? So the bourgeoisie are among the same groups who make our laws. And so they are unlikely to criminalize behavior that they do, and are much more likely to criminalize behavior that is common among the proletariat. Right? But they can't always get away with it, right? I mean, again, sort of murder is murder for the most part. So like some laws are neutral to whichever class you're in. But then taking it a step further, the bourgeoisie then uses law enforcement to enforce laws differentially, right? And I'm sure we all get that at this point. There is racial and class bias within our law enforcement and our criminal justice system. There just is at this point. And so, you know, the idea is the bourgeoisie are, that's to their liking. They don't have any interest in changing that because it works for them. So if you're, let's say, a white collar offender, you're far less likely to be caught and far less likely to be convicted and sentenced seriously, because according to this theory, you have the resources of the law behind you. Whereas if you commit a low level offense and you're on the street doing so, you're far more likely to get caught, have no resources to navigate the criminal justice system, and face a sanction for it. And so his argument is, well, of course that's the case. It's by design, right? It's by design because of the kind of culture we live in. I'm thinking that sounded good to me, but if you don't get it, you let me know. So again, people are talking about this today more like the 99%, 1%, and there's a lot of focus now on, you know, law enforcement at the policing level and the critique of the policing. But taking it a step back, Marx actually, and people who interpreted work, are arguing we actually need to look further up at who's making the laws, and so then we're looking at, you know, highest government officials, Congress, etc., and how are they doing those to their advantage. Similarly, how do they surround themselves with sort of like-minded people? So, you know, if you look at like political cabinets or whatever from the president, you tend to see, you know, again, very like-minded people, very similar in their outlook, and tend to be from fairly affluent, you know, privileged backgrounds. And so we may be seeing some changes in some of that in Congress now, as we're seeing some younger people take office and some people from less, you know, powerful backgrounds, a change of pace. So that could be interesting. But Marx argued, you know, if you tinker with the people, you're never going to really make the change that you need, because it's a system that's the problem, not actually just the individuals in it. So of course there are limitations to that. One is that it's just simply really macro focused, right? So it's a focus on your sort of whole, how you align your society. And like that makes, to me, a lot of sense, but doesn't really explain Joe over there's offense. Like Joe was committing his offense because he's the proletariat and he's alienated and he's the, you know, probably wasn't thinking like that, right? So at the bigger picture, I think it gives us some things to think about, but at the individual level, it maybe doesn't help explain any one offender's actions. And then the argument too is that it kind of like leans towards siding with the underdog. Like, oh, if you're the proletariat, if you commit a crime, it's because you're oppressed, and instead of like, that might be a factor, but you actually still did do it. So like the criticism is it's too, you know, it's too leftist basically, which, you know, it very much is. It's very much aligned with the most left kind of progressive thinking. So I don't think this unfortunately will ever be a thing, even though now we're talking a lot in the various political discussions about, you know, whether Joe Biden, if he's elected, is going to take the United States on some radical leftist turn. I don't think so. That's not what I see or hear. I don't think we're ever moving this far of what you know, Marx was talking about, because what he was really talking about is the bottom bullet point. The only way to get rid of some of these inequalities, both in criminal justice and elsewhere, is to get rid of capitalism and become a socialistic society where we're egalitarian, right? Where there isn't one group over the other, etc. I don't see that happening in the United States. I mean, you know, again, there's critiques that Joe Biden and others are socialists, but they're not by definition. They may be leaning closer that way than others, but they're certainly not in and of themselves socialists. So that's probably not going to happen, or anytime soon at least. But we could address some of these systemic inequalities in criminal justice. Again, Marx would have disavowed that, because he'd been like, you're just tinkering and you're never going to fix it. But at least tinkering to make it better is better. And again, we could look at replacing like our retributive criminal justice system, where it's win-lose kind of thing, with a more egalitarian system like a restorative justice, where people had more say and more voice, and therefore like inequalities might be less. So these would be sort of natural outcomes if we were to believe radical or conflict theory were to be true. Sorry, having wig problems. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of theories that are considered feminist theories. So we're only just going to talk about a little of them, because there's a lot of feminist theories. But feminist theories really arose in the 1960s, and it was a response to what they call the androcentrism of criminology previously. Androcentric means to be male-focused, and it really was. Honestly, before the 1960s, there weren't any female criminologists, And so it was all males studying males, theorizing about males. And so in the 1960s, as we started to see a women's liberation movement happening, like with the civil rights movement, women started to enter the field of criminology and started to say, maybe we have a different perspective. Maybe we should be studying females and see if they offend in the same way and for the same reasons. And so these theories first came out of that. So that's why the first one, the liberation theory with the question mark, is dubious, but it was the starting point. So it's kind of important. The idea here was proposed by a female criminologist named Frida Adler, that as women became more liberated, they would commit more crime and even more violent crime. So it was totally counter to like previous ideas that if women committed crime or violence, they were like hysterical, like what Freud would have said, or they had mental illness, or they were some kind of like abomination to women. Her argument was like, no, really, basically crime and violence are kind of about like access. If you've not been able to do much outside of the home, of course you've not committed many offenses outside of the home. But as you have more access to the workplace and you're out in public more, doing more, that liberation may also result in more crime or violence. That kind of made sense to people, but in reality, that hasn't borne out in data really. Like basically, females' crime rates are generally pretty consistent. There was no spike after the women's liberation movement that would have given support to this idea. So that doesn't seem to have a lot of explanatory power. So some people argue then, well, it's biological, like that women just biologically don't have as much in them to commit violence or crime, but that's not been proven either, right? That's, in fact, we did the reading last week about biology and crime, and most of our behavior isn't biological. So it makes no sense to think women's would be more so than men's. So if it's not either of those things, then you gotta keep trying, right? And so they kept trying to develop other feminist related theories. So the chivalry theory was the idea that maybe women actually do offend in similar rates, but they're treated more leniently by the criminal justice system. The whole like notion of men give chivalry to women, you know, they open their door, they treat them gently, etc. And so maybe the idea is male police officers or male criminal justice officials give women like a little pass, you know. And that also could make some sense, right? And in fact, there's some support for it. There's actually support for it, though, only amongst like low-level offenses. So maybe if you've ever heard this like sort of stereotype of women can talk their way out of like a traffic accident, there's actually some data to bear that out, that women are more likely to be able to talk themselves out of a traffic accident, especially when it's a male officer, which our police officers are still overwhelmingly male, right? But in the middle, like kind of offenses, you know, more serious offenses, but not your most serious violent ones, it's dubious whether there's any kind of chivalry effect. And then when you get to like really serious offenses, it's actually the opposite, interestingly enough. So when women, for instance, kill their spouse and as part of like a domestic violence situation, they typically get convicted more often and are more likely to face a more significant sentence in prison. If women kill their own children, they are way more likely to get convicted and sentenced to prison than are men who kill their own children. So there seems to be like, again, support at the low level, but at the high level, it's almost like it interacts with like gender role norms. And the idea is, oh, you don't get to be a woman who not only committed an offense, but you did one that kind of violates your traditional gender roles of being like nurturing or whatever. So just kind of interesting. Again, didn't really totally bear out to have a lot of explanatory power for women's criminal behavior or violent behavior. So the one that I like best that does come from a feminist tradition blends a micro and macro look, which I think is kind of important, you know, because like I said earlier, the micro ones are maybe too focused on the individual, and the macro are so focused on the societal that like somewhere in the middle is probably where we can try to explain like a person's crime, right? So at the macro level, power control theory argues that the United States is still a patriarchal society. So that means we are a society where it's male dominated and male identified. Not necessarily physically dominated, because actually there are fewer males than females in the US, but the people in the power positions still are males. And that is just actually true. Like we just are. I mean, you look at representation in politics and corporations and pretty much every major institution, males have more control there. So we are a patriarchal society. Okay? So they argue, that these theorists, that at the micro level, like at the family level, we mimic that patriarchy. So males are still dominant in the family, and therefore are more controlling of girls than they are of boys. So for instance, girls have like, earlier curfews and aren't allowed to go out and do certain things, where boys are often given the right to do so. And the argument is, if that's the way things roll in your family, then of course boys commit more delinquency or violence or crime because they simply are able to. They're under less control, right? And so the idea of power control theory is, if we became less patriarchal, and both the family and in the society, we wouldn't necessarily see females committing more crime, but we would see males committing less, right? Because there'd be less of this like dominance and power kind of thing. Okay, moving along, and again, I'm just gonna pause for a second. Oh, no, I don't need to. Okay, nobody's asking questions, so I guess I'm either doing this awesome or you're like just listening half. I don't know. I hope you're good. So the general theory of crime builds on that idea of a blended theory. So taking not just one theory to explain all crime, but to say there might be elements from a lot of these previous ones. Okay, and so what they argue is the start of crime or violence, because they're kind of not always, but often interchangeable, at least in criminological world, they generally are. So the start here is people have a lack of self-control, okay? And that develops usually through your family and your school. So obviously the critique of it is it's blaming your families and your schools, but the idea is your family helps you build control of yourself, right? They teach you skills to do so, so does your school. If you lack that, you're maybe too impulsive, you have trouble focusing, whatever, and then you see some kind of opportunity, so you can see here like routine activities theory a little bit, then maybe you commit an act of crime or violence, right? So your lack of self-control was your motivating factor, okay? And then your opportunity is what made you act on that sort of motivating factor, if you will. And then blending little bits of labeling, they also argue that when juveniles have been labeled negatively, they're stigmatized by parents, school, etc., juvenile delinquency, they're even more likely to seize those opportunities to act on their lack of self-control. So what I like about this, again, is the blended element of it. So it kind of shows you, like, if you remember, routine activities assumes a motivated offender. It's like, well, what made you motivated in the first place? Maybe here you're saying, well, it's because you've never developed good self-control skills, so it's not, that's your kind of motivation or your background or whatever. Here's another one that I like because it blends different components. Okay, this is from guys named Sampson and Loeb, and they call their theory turning points. And the basic idea is, backing up for a second, I'm sorry, most offenders age out of offending. You've probably heard this in other crim classes. So they talk about in criminology the chronic 6%. That's the people who start as juvenile delinquents and continue offending through life, through their adulthood. Most do not do that. Most who are juvenile offenders at some point cease being an offender. And so this was taking a look at that and saying, well, how do we explain the people who then successfully get out of offending or never started in the first place, and the people who kind of keep on keeping on? And so these guys argued that there are key turning points in our transition from adolescence to adulthood. And if those occur appropriately, smoothly, generally are good, positive things, that help kind of constrain us from crime. So if you remember from the other day, like the social control theories, the ones about constraining crime, this kind of borrows from that a little bit, the idea that, you know, you need factors in your life that will prevent crime, and that is these smooth transitions. And that also through those smooth transitions in your life, like graduation, getting a job or going to college or the military, marrying, maybe having a family, those are kind of some of the major transitions. But as you go through those smoothly, you build what they call social capital. Social capital is basically like connections, right? Connections, attachments, commitments, investment in your life. So again, kind of borrowing from social control theory, right? Attachment, commitment, belief, that stuff. So as you build that, you're less likely to offend or to continue offending if you started, right? And again, I think that probably makes some sense, right? Graduation was a big high school marker, let's say, for you. You got through it. Holy crap, now you're doing well. You're feeling good about yourself. You go to college, you say, you meet new friends, you get new mentors. You're like, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to get a good job. Like, those trajectories can keep you positive, can keep you meeting people who will keep you out of trouble, as well as you have investments that you don't want to lose, right? They actually say to this point about military, because that's one choice, of course, after school, which we're kind of going to be critiquing a little bit in this class, but not because of anyone's choice about military, but just as a whole militarism. If you did the reading, you saw that. But what's interesting about that is there's some research about gang members in very urban areas, for instance, like South Central LA, and the number one thing that gets them to leave, like to desist the gang, and it is military service. Not that they all do that. A lot of people, of course, desist on their own, but military is like a Kickstarter. And it makes sense because it's like you're away from the people who are the influences that were not good. You have a structure, a very rigid one, and discipline and all those things. And by the time you come back, let's say 4 years later, you're a different person. And you might also then have gained skills and knowledge and even maybe job abilities that don't make you have to move back in that environment in the first place. So it's just kind of an interesting research that while there's, I think, a very legit critique of militarism that we're talking about or reading about and our speaker is going to talk about, in one respect, it has been this very positive in the lives of people. But the argument there is, well, that shouldn't be your only way to get out of gang, right? We should invest in communities so that you don't have to go serve overseas in a dangerous war in order to get out of something in your neighborhood. Okay, we're almost done, which is going to be good because we might have a couple times for any questions or anything, a couple minutes for any questions or anything, and maybe a couple minutes to talk about the reading before our speaker joins us. So these are some that you may or may not have heard of because they're not usually presented in criminology classes. So Hannah Arendt was writing after the Holocaust, and she was looking kind of like the Milgram experiments, if you all remember those from other classes, or the Zimbardo prison experiment. She was looking at how did this happen? Because most of the people who were involved as prison guards, let's say in the concentration camps, or, you know, those lower level, any of them really, weren't like psychopaths. They weren't evil human beings going in. They were everyday people who did everyday bad things. Like, how do you get from being a normal person to like burning people in a concentration camp? Like, it's almost inexplicable. And so what she argues, I like this quote, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. They just kind of follow along, right? They get into a system or a structure and they follow along. Those of you guys who are in my Crim 307 class, we watched a short video by Philip Zimbardo about this. He argues that for instance, he was arguing about this exact same thing only in Abu Ghraib prison, where U.S. military officials committed torture. He was arguing these were totally normal people going in, but they were in a nasty situation created by people who should never have created that situation, right? The war on terror in this particular case, in the case of Nazi or the Holocaust. And they were just, it's easy to go along, right? And it's hard to dissent when you're in that kind of bureaucratic culture. And so it's similar to the concept of groupthink, if you've ever heard that concept. So this is a definition of groupthink, a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, right? So the cohesive group in these examples would be the military at Abu Ghraib or Nazi officials. And when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. So you don't want to stand out as like the worst of the worst in any of these environments. You just want to go along and be, I'm just another soldier doing my job. I'm just another, you know, official doing my job. And so you don't necessarily speak up or dissent, and don't even really actually always contemplate alternate courses of action. There's a lot of research on groupthink that how it leads to really nasty bureaucratic decisions. So one of the first studies about groupthink was looking at the Challenger space shuttle explosion in the 1980s, where there was a ton of people who had some level of involvement with the creation of that shuttle and then its launching before it exploded. And what they found after the fact is several people involved with the creation of it knew that there were some flaws. They absolutely had awareness that this thing was probably going to default at least to some level. But because this was this kind of cohesive unit and everybody was like so excited and stoked for the launching of the space shuttle, they kept quiet and they didn't feel like they could dissent and say, concerned about that part, guys, let's hold the phone. And of course, it's resulted in this tragedy. There's other research around, you've probably heard of the Ford Pinto that exploded because the gas tank was in the wrong part of the car, and how Ford employees knew that this was going to be a problem, and some of them like could have said something more, but they were just like, oh, better not, better just do my job, and it resulted in atrocity. So the idea is that a lot of violence, especially violence like military violence and violence like genocides and those kind of things, happen from groupthink. Next week, we'll also be talking about like militarism with a speaker. And then the week after that, we're looking at hate crimes. And you can see this, you'll see the same kind of pattern where a lot of hate crimes are the result of this groupthink idea, where somebody becomes immersed in a group and they're no longer even sort of questioning themselves or thinking themselves about what the group is doing. They just kind of like go along. And so related to that is another concept, which is called normalization of deviance. The idea is that once you get into an organization that is doing things that are deviant, it becomes normal, like it, just like the terms, right? And you don't even question it. It's just the way things roll in that organization. So like, for instance, the Abu Ghraib US prison example, what they were doing there was by every definition torture, but it was what they were feeling like they were authorized to do, and everyone seemingly was doing it, so it didn't become deviant. It became considered, this is how you interrogate somebody, this is how we do this business, right? They didn't step back from it and say, you probably shouldn't like attach wires to some guy's penis, like you probably shouldn't make them naked pile up in a pyramid, like that's probably not necessary. But they couldn't take that step back because they were in that setting, in that situation, and what they were doing culturally had not been defined as deviant in that setting. I'm not going to have you guys watch this video now because of timing wise or whatever, but it's an interesting little video about this concept of normalization of deviance. So the idea, kind of connecting it to militarism, is that the United States has engaged in, since World War II, honestly, in a number of what would be considered illegal wars. Illegal by our own domestic legislation that requires Congress in most circumstances to authorize war, and Congress has not authorized a lot of these violent encounters we've been involved with. And within that, certainly not all, but some military officials have committed, again, some pretty heinous offenses that have been taken now as just the way business is done, as opposed to as deviant. So there's a whole kind of literature about militarism and normalization of deviance. So I wanted to kind of weave those pieces together. So I'm going to stop the sharing now. Okay, so I see some comments. So let me look at those now. Okay. What's the case if a woman kills her rapist but still kills her? Oh, that's an interesting question from Stephanie. So it really varies. A good question, I'm sure everyone can see it. What's the case if a woman kills her rapist but still gets convicted? Happens all the time. Happens all the time when a woman kills her domestic abuser and is still convicted. Because self-defense is open to interpretation from a jury, and in particular, even before from a jury, it's open to interpretation by a prosecutor and a judge to even let that be a possible defense, or let that even be a possible option in that court. So, sometimes they don't even get the ability to argue kind of self-defense, let alone if it happens after the fact. Like, are you really defending yourself if you went out and killed that person after, right? So it's very common that somebody who kills a rapist or domestic abuser ends up convicted. Not always, but very, very common. So that was why actually in the 1970s, there was a case, they called it the Burning Bed. It was a real case out of Michigan, made into a movie later, years later, but it was a woman who'd been abused for years and years by her husband. And this was before there were a lot of good laws on domestic violence. And so, the police would sometimes come and they'd be like, leave her alone, and he wouldn't, and whatever. She felt like she was stuck, nothing gonna happen. She felt like she was gonna die at some point. So at one point though, she waited till he was asleep and she set his bed on fire and he burned to death. And so he, later she was facing trial because they were like, this is not self-defense. You chose to wait here, you could have fled, but she eventually was not convicted. It was one of the first cases where the jury bought like a battered woman's defense, saying in some of these kind of cases, you're so like, don't feel like you have options, that like, while an outsider might say, oh, you could have fled and you had options, she didn't see that. Like, that wasn't even on her radar. So it was a good question. All right. Are there other questions while we have a few minutes? Okay, I'm trying to get into the big picture so I can see when Al joins us. Okay. There we go. There's all your faces. Okay. All right. So what time do we have? 6:40. Okay. So he should be joining us in a couple minutes. Any other questions about the reading or about what the theories we just reviewed, assignments, anything you have questions about? So far, so good.
I don't have a question. I have a statement.
Okay.
About the first article, I felt like they were coming for. Can you turn up your mute, please? I felt like they were coming for people like the crime shows, and I felt really offended because I was like, dang, that's one of the reasons why I'm even a crim major in the first place was the Criminal Minds, the CSI, and I just felt like, why is he attacking the shows? Like, I feel like the shows are good.
I hear you. And I agree with you. I used to be one who was like, I won't watch any of this because they are often like flawed, which is true, but that doesn't mean they don't spark your interest like they did with you. In fact, I think that's probably why we have so many majors in the first place, and across the country, is people are like, hey, this stuff is interesting. How else would you know, right? You're not like intimately involved with the criminal justice system, so you got to see it somewhere. So like, so I've started to like loosen my thoughts on it too. But yeah, I hear you. That was a little tacky. There are some legit concerns with some of them, you know, how like CSI, for instance, like makes it look like one person's job is to be like a CSI guy or whatever. That's like actually like 7 different people's jobs. And it's probably like most of them is like, I fingerprint, I do that, you know, like, but they make it look like it's exciting and you're all doing this all interesting shit and you're like, no. But hey, thank you, Danielle. I see Al has joined us. Hi, Al. Can you hear us, Al? He's there, but I can't hear anything from him. Oh, maybe now. Okay. So I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit more in a second, but as soon as we get him more fully on, I'll tell you a little bit about why I asked Al to speak to us. Al, can you hear us yet? There he is.
Sorry.
No worries. I was worried like we had like, I can see you, but I can't hear you.
I had everything set up except these. Yeah.
No worries. I don't think I explained to you that I always wear weird costumes while I do these things. So tonight's my weird Miami Heat costume outfit. So you're probably like, what is she doing?
What is weird about that?
Well, I guess this one's not too weird. The other day, though, I was Joe Exotic from the Tiger King, and that one might have been a little strange.
Okay.
But you are perfectly on time. We were just wrapping up some stuff that we needed to and just got started talking about how that relates to militarism. So it's a perfect transition. So guys, I'm going to let you be in the able hands of Al. So let me just tell you, Al and I just recently met virtually. We've not met in person because we have mutual friends and colleagues who are involved in peace and justice movements that introduced us. Al's got a long career, and he'll tell you more about working in various parts of peace movements, and he is working on with some others Florida Peace Alliance, and so he may tell you guys a little bit about that. It might be something you even want to be involved with, but of course, as it sounds, the idea is to end militarism and promote peace. So I'll let Al say more about yourself, and you have it. Take it away as what you need. You got my class.
All right. Well,
thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Finley, for letting me be here tonight and for speaking to your class. And by the way, I'm going to put on a PowerPoint presentation, and I've heard that thing about, you know, death by PowerPoint. So I hope this isn't your death, and I hope you find some of the slides in the PowerPoint presentation interesting and thoughtful and whatever thought-provoking. I'm going to,
I'm sorry, would you mind actually sending that to me too? Just, I am recording, but I also will upload, if you're okay with it, your PowerPoint onto our platform we use for our class called Canvas, so that students can see it later if they need it?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Now, let's see where is my PowerPoint? Okay, here's the first part of it. Okay, let's go back to, bear with me here. So I've only done this where I'm the okay, how do if I go to share screen, share screen. There we are. Okay, do you see that now? Are folks seeing a slide that says employment effects of military and domestic spending priorities?
Yes.
Yep, I do.
Okay, all right, good.
Thank you.
Then that has worked. Okay, what I'm going to be presenting on is some research done at the University of Massachusetts Amherst on military spending and the employment effects. How many jobs are created by spending money on military and war and preparation for war, and it touches on the topics of what are our national priorities and what happens when you spend $1 billion. I put my contact information in there, my emails anyway, for you to, if you want to contact me about any of this. And I'm also using a new cursor and a keyboard, so I'm hoping this will work. As Dr. Finley said, I'm associated with a program called World Beyond War. I'm the local coordinator for a World Beyond War chapter here in Central Florida. World Beyond War is a global movement. It really is an international organization, folks all over the world. It began in 2014, and I've been associated with it for quite a bit of time. It was founded by the fellow who wrote this book that I'm showing on my Waging Peace. David Hartsoe is one of the co-founders. David is a fellow who is a very courageous, heroic, and I know that word gets overused, person. He knew Martin Luther King Jr. He met John F. Kennedy. He's devoted his entire life to the cause of peace and to the end of war. The other co-founder is a fellow by the name of David Swanson. One of David Swanson's book is War is a Lie. And he refutes in his book and throughout a lot of his work, he deals with a lot of the lies that have been used to justify war. My background in this, early on, right in high school, my goal was to go to the Air Force Academy because I wanted to be a pilot, and that was during the war against Vietnam. I successfully got the appointment to the Air Force Academy and went through all of the most rigorous part of it, through the survival training and all the discipline and all the, all that kind of stuff that you go through. After 2 years, though, of seeing war films and watching F-4s drop napalm on Vietnamese villages and having people in my squadron cheer, I said, boy, we're killing people. And then another point there was that my squadron beer mug, and I don't know if in college they still have beer mugs, but back then beer mugs were plenty popular. Our logo was a nuclear bomb exploding. And when we went into the dining hall where we all ate together at one time, our squadron cheer was 35th Squadron Nukem. And we sort of joked about dropping nuclear bombs on people. Well, that got me to the point where I said, I can't do this and I need to leave the academy. So I went from there into a related field, got a master's in social work, and got involved in a lot of other social justice causes and so on. Converted to Catholicism, by the way, as a fairly young adult, and got involved in a lot of other kinds of social justice ministries. When we invaded Iraq, when our country invaded Iraq in 2003, that one, I said, I was thinking after Vietnam, geez, we've done this enough. Then we invaded Iraq the first time. Then we decided to invade Iraq again. And I said, I've got to work for peace. And about that time, I also got involved, by the way, in a program called Just Faith, which is a ecumenical program. It's originated in the Catholic Church, but Just Faith is a 9-month program. And at the end of that program, I asked myself, we were assigned to, or asked to discern, what is it you want to do with this learning and this instruction that you've had? And to me, it kept coming back to peace. And so I said, I'm going to work literally for world peace and for an end to war. And that's how I got involved in World Beyond War. Dr. Finley mentioned the Florida Peace and Justice Alliance. We are creating that now, and on September 27th, we're having what we're calling the inaugural meeting or the launch of the organization. That's an alliance of various peace and justice organizations throughout the state of Florida. We're inviting them to join now so that we have a louder, more effective voice, and we can be active in the street and call for action for various peace and justice issues. And we are very much tuned into the whole notion that racism and poverty and militarism are all related, as Dr. King taught, and kind of one of the causes, for which he was assassinated. So I want to put plugs in there also for you as people to consider. You might want to look at starting your own chapter of World Beyond War. And if you know peace and justice organizations that might be interested in the Florida Peace and Justice Alliance, would encourage you to invite them, or to put your email or contact information in the chat box or somewhere, or contact me. And I hope you'll consider that. Another thing that's coming up is on the World Day of Peace. International Day of Peace has been around since 1985. On September 21st is they're presenting a film entitled We Are Many, and it's about the effectiveness of mass demonstrations and the power of people. And this relates to the invasion of Iraq, but it also relates to efforts by the people to stop our attempts to create war in Syria and elsewhere in the world. So I would encourage you to look at World Beyond War and go to the WorldBeyondWar.org / International Day of Peace to find a lot of events that are scheduled, but most significantly is that movie entitled We Are Many. Okay, now to the topic at hand. This is the employment effects. This is the title of the research that they did. The employment effects of military and domestic spending, priorities. And it was, okay, I want to do this in the context. We're talking about what do you get for $1 billion? Here's the context of where we are right now in this country. We're having a deficit of $3.3 trillion this year, and that's more than triple the $984 billion deficit that we had last year. We're looking at that deficit between now and 2030. The cumulative deficit will be another $16.3 trillion in deficit spending that our country is engaged in. What that means is that now we have a U.S. national debt. That number shows $25 trillion. That's now over $26 trillion. And what we're doing in our country is spending on war and militarism now and asking generations later to pay for it. We're funding war by credit card. And we are now, what this slide shows you is that we have now exceeded the point where the interest on our deficits is exceeding what we're spending on the future being the young people and the children, current children, programs for children, support for children. The interest on our debt is exceeding how much we care for children in this country. So our priorities, in my opinion, are way off. Soon our debt, but by 2050, when you all are middle-aged people and I'm way gone, our debt will reach 231% of GDP. So it's in that context of this huge deficit spending and debt that I want to talk about military spending. And as President Trump told Nora O'Donnell on CBS this morning, I am the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I made a fortune using debt, and if things don't work, I renegotiate the debt. So now back to the research. This is an update that was done. They originated this research in 2005, and then they provided an update in 2009, and then again in 2011, and this is the most recent research. So again, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Dr. Robert Pollin and Dr. Heidi Garrett-Peltier did this research, and the link is there for where you can find the actual documents that they produced. When we talk about the military, President Trump in 2017 was very proud of the fact that a bill, I think it was that the U.S. had sold $100 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And President Trump said, just sign the bill, our military will be stronger. We love and need our military, and gave them everything and more. And this is jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, yeah, it is jobs. The military spends a lot of money and creates a lot of jobs. And this is important locally. Our local chambers of commerce, our statewide economic development commissions, our churches, our schools, our state legislators, our governors, our members of Congress, all think, and they're correct, jobs are very important, and all of them want to do everything they can to preserve jobs. In 1993, some 27 years ago, I lived in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. They closed Chanute Air Force Base in our county, and you would have thought it was going to be the end of the world. And it got all kinds of political resistance and so on. The local economy survived. The world has gone on without that unnecessary Air Force base in central Illinois. The loss was a few bars closed and a few strip joints closed. But nevertheless, the military does create jobs. What Dr. Pollin and Dr. Garrett-Peltier did in their research, they used this input-output model of the U.S. economy, which is produced every 5 years, and it's updated annually by the Department of Commerce. It was this input-output analytic framework was first developed in the 30s by the Nobel laureate economist Wassily Leontief. It looks at all of the factors, the inputs that go into producing a given output. So how many workers, kind of equipment, how much concrete, how much energy, all of these inputs that go into, say, producing a fighter jet, a hospital, a school, etc. Those are the outputs. And then they looked also at the inputs and the outputs that are needed to keep that fighter jet or the hospital or the school or a windmill functioning. They then looked at three factors that are in the input and output model. The first are called direct effects, and secondly, the indirect effects, and third, induced effects. And these are the effects that impact job creation. Direct effects are the jobs that are created by producing the fighter bomber or the school or the windmill. The people who actually work on putting that jet together, or building the school, or building the windmill. The indirect effects are the jobs associated with the industries that supply intermediate goods for building the fighter bomber or the school. This would include like the steel in a school, or the metals in a fighter jet, or the avionics in a fighter jet, or the water fountains in the school, or the trucks that deliver concrete. All of those things are the indirect effects that impact job creation. And then lastly, it's the induced effects. This is the expansion of employment that results when people who are paid to build the fighter jet or the school or the hospital or whatever, they go out and spend their money, and they go to Subway, or they go to the gym, or they go to buy gasoline, or they hire their lawyer, or they go to the doctor's office. Those are called the induced effects. So they looked at direct effects, indirect effects, induced effects in terms of job creation. They also looked at labor intensity, the domestic content, and compensation per worker. Basically, this means that labor intensity is that some industry or sectors of the economy are more labor intensive. For example, education requires more people than does the military, or than does manufacturing. They're more people intensive, more labor intensive. Education and healthcare, for example, is more labor intensive than those other sectors of the economy. They also looked at domestic content, so that if their research was focused on job creation in the United States, so how much of the money that those people make is spent in the US. And they know from data that, for example, the military spend about 43% of their income on domestic goods, whereas the rest of the civilian population spends 78% on domestic products. So that gets into that induced effect, so that when you spend the money in the US, you create more jobs in the US. Then they looked at compensation per worker. So if you're spending $1 million and you pay one employee $1 million, you create one job. Obviously, if you pay people $50,000, you can create 20 jobs. So they looked at compensation, and the overall compensation in education and healthcare are slightly lower than the compensation levels in the military and militarism. And that's not because of professor pay, that's because of assistants and so on, and teachers' assistants, or in healthcare, certified nurse assistants and so on, not physicians. So what did they put all these numbers together? Let's see if that, there. And here's the results. So they compared military versus simply giving tax cuts, returning the money to the people, to you and I, to go spend the money as we please, versus spending the money on clean energy, or spending the money on healthcare or education. So when you spend $1 billion, that's where what happens when you spend $1 billion, that's where that came from. You create 6,800 direct jobs, 1,800 indirect jobs, or 8,600 direct and indirect jobs. Then it also creates 2,600 induced jobs, for a total job creation of 11,200 jobs. However, if you simply give that $1 billion back to the taxpayers, let them spend it for however they want to on televisions, computers, new cars, or doctor's visits, or Subway sandwiches, or whatever, that's going to create 15,100 jobs, or 35% more than spending the same on military. If you spend that $1 billion on clean energy, it's going to create 16,800 jobs, or 50% more than if you spend the money on military and war, preparation for war. If you spend it on healthcare, you're going to create 17,200 jobs, 54% more jobs. If you spend it on education, you're going to create 26,700 jobs, fully 138% of what you get for the same money by spending it on the military. Then they looked at the wages, and they also looked at benefits, but this is going to focus just on wages. And what you can see there is these are data from 2010, by the way, so $32,000 and so on. The numbers would need to be updated for 2020, but so these are, again, these are 2010 data. What this shows is that that in healthcare and clean energy and education, you get over here in these jobs between 32,000 and 64,000 and 64,000 and above. You can look over here and see there are more jobs in that middle income and sort of higher income ranges created in clean energy, healthcare, and education than in the military. So what this means is that not only do you create more jobs, but you create more middle income and higher income jobs in the country. Now, what would happen if we spent $60 billion? Well, the numbers are obviously 60 times the billion. So you'd create 1,600,000 jobs if you spent 60 billion on education. You'd create 1 million jobs in healthcare. You'd create 1 million jobs in clean energy, 900,000 jobs in tax cuts versus about not quite 700,000 jobs by spending 60 billion on the military. Where would we come up with $60 billion? That's a huge amount of money. In just the last 3 years, we have increased military spending and spending on military contracts and contractors and war and so on. We have increased military spending by $100 billion in just 3 years. This $60 billion figure came from it's the Bipartisan Commission on Wartime Contracting, which concluded that $60 billion had been wasted just simply from fraud and abuse on projects in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 10 years. So in Afghanistan, a lot of the money we taxpayers were spending was going to fund the Taliban, to provide security for U.S. forces. We had no bid contracts that tripled in, so those have been that waste and fraud there. So it's that kind of waste, $60 billion, as Congress said, would just be on fraud and waste in military spending. And look at the difference in job creation that would create for the U.S. So the question is not whether the military spending creates jobs. Yes, of course it creates jobs. It is whether more jobs would be created by the same amount of money invested. And this is kind of a summary. $1 billion devoted to tax cuts creates 35% more jobs. Spending on clean energy produces 50% more jobs. Spending on healthcare, 54% more jobs. Spending on education, 138% more jobs. So if this is so true, how do we spend our taxpayer dollars? Well, here's from National Priorities Project. This is discretionary spending. We spend 59%, $679 billion, and I'll get to that number because that's not the full amount. 59% of our discretionary spending goes towards war and militarism. And you can see the priorities for those other kinds of things. So this shows in the fiscal year 2021 discretionary budget, 55% is going towards military versus non-military, again on the discretionary budget. If we look at where the current administration was projecting, they wanted to increase military spending to 65% of the discretionary budget by 2023. I mentioned earlier that $679 billion isn't the total. What we spend on war, preparation for war, and so on actually amounts to over about $1.3 trillion. You got the base budget of $554 billion. You've got the $173 billion, which is actually paying for the what are called overseas contingencies. This is the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and Africa and Libya and Syria and all over the world where we are engaged in military activities. Got the nuclear budget that's $25 billion a year, which is going to upgrade our military, our nuclear weapons to make them, quote, more usable. We're going to spend somewhere around $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years. That $1.5 trillion is going to go, a big chunk of that is going to go to 5 military contractors that work on nuclear weapons. Then you've got all the rest of the money for, homeland security, not to mention at the bottom there, the defense share of the national debt, and I go back to the national debt, is going to be $156 billion. So a total of $1.3 trillion that we spend on war and militarism. When we compare the US to other countries, we're spending, again, this isn't the total amount, but $732 billion, that's the defense budget. Compared to the next 10 countries, $726 billion. Look at those countries there. South Korea is an ally. Japan's an ally. United Kingdom is an ally. Germany is an ally. France is an ally. We claim Saudi Arabia is an ally. Sometimes India is an ally. We are spending alone more than the next 10 countries, but then when you throw in what our supposed allies are also spending, we're spending so much more than any potential adversaries in the world. And what we're proposing to do is to cut humanitarian aid, cut foreign affairs and diplomacy efforts, while we increase military aid. So when you hear about foreign aid, about 30% of foreign aid actually goes to fund militaries. It's military support in foreign countries around the world. Here's the total that we've spent since 2001. This amounts to somewhere around, I believe it's $6.4 trillion since the war on terror began. We are now to the point where we're spending $32.08 million every hour on war. Every hour, US taxpayers are spending $10.05 million on the interest on this war debt since 2001. Okay, so you can spend $1 billion on the military. You can buy, F-35 fighter jets that some in the military say they don't want or need. You can buy more aircraft carriers. You can buy more nuclear weapons. Or you can spend that money on healthcare and provide care for the physically challenged or the elderly, or prenatal care, or for preventive care, or for care for mental health services or substance use disorders. We can provide that kind of priority. We could spend the money on education and hire more teachers, build more schools, fund more preschool, provide tuition support, provide trade and technical schools, provide teachers' aides, STEM training, and STEM education, all those kinds of things. We could spend the money on clean energy and focus on solar and wind and hydroelectric and geothermal and ocean currents and so on. But instead, and this political cartoon, by the way, comes from 1955. Our country recognized this that long ago, that when we look at priorities in our country, only one guest is served, and we don't fund healthcare, we don't fund the sciences, we don't fund education, we don't fund arts, but we have more than enough money for war and militarism. And then I just want to include this quote. This is President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. That's what we're doing. So I want to make a plug here again for, for some consideration about what are our priorities. And all that money, I want to remind you, all that money that we spent, that $5 or $6 trillion, and the $1 trillion we spend every year, none of that helped to prevent 9/11. It didn't protect us from the 2007 or 2008 recession, the global recession we all went through. It hasn't certainly helped us from, protect us, defend us from the pandemic. It hasn't defended us from exorbitant healthcare costs. It hasn't defended us from racism. Hasn't defended us from police brutality or excess incarceration, or defended us from income inequality, or from limited educational opportunities, or defended us from voter suppression. And yet providing for the common defense is enshrined in the preamble to the Constitution. So with that, I think I will close, and let me see if I stop share. Unless I'll just, I don't know if I should leave that. I stop share. I don't know if I should stop share and open it up for Q&A or. So.
I think that's good, Ellen. And if we need to go back, we can always share again if people want to refer to a specific slide or whatever. Thank you so much. That was a really succinct commentary on a lot of really important issues that I hope my students are seeing connect with the stuff that I asked them to read for this week and whatever. I have a couple questions or comments and thoughts, but I want to see if they do before I start babbling. So anybody, again, you can type them in the chat and I'll read them and kind of facilitate that. Or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment, feel free to do so. Give it a second for everybody to kind of sit with that. I'm likely guessing that there are some, maybe they will emerge, or maybe we're getting quiet now, but I'll go with some of mine and maybe they'll stimulate some stuff, whatever. I love what you did here in showing that this is like not a new issue, right? That we were warned from Dwight Eisenhower, a military man himself,
right,
about what students may or may not have heard the term, but military industrial complex. And yep. Eisenhower warned that, again, he was a military dude. That was his background. That was his life, his love, whatever. But he warned that we're getting out of control, guys. Like, once we build this thing, this bigger, better, faster, more military, we are going to use it more, whether we should be or should not be. And he was very cautious about that military spending. and again, how we would go forward and use our military in places maybe we shouldn't be or not even wanted to be. So I think that's a really important piece of it, that it's not new. And also in the charts that Al showed us, you see this is not a partisan issue either. You know, you see that some of this military spending spikes were even under Democratic presidents. Like, this is not a, oh, we're anti-Trump, so let's be anti-military. This is about, like, this is a legit, like, systemic problem in the US. So I think that's a really, you know, important piece of it.
One of the, you mentioned the history, and recall when we invaded Iraq in 2003, one of the comments made, I think it was Colin Powell, who, you know, was certainly advocating for war. But, you know, the phrase was, if you break it, you got to fix it. We invaded that country with all the shock and awe. And we thought, and in 30 to 60 days, we thought the military, you know, actions were going to be over. We're still dealing with the repercussions of invading that country, and we destroyed that country. And we know now that somewhere around 800,000 people have been displaced worldwide. In Iraqis, no, I'm sorry, Iraqis are dead. 37 million people have been displaced worldwide from US military actions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, all over the world.
And unlike in previous engagements like World War I and World War II, the bulk of the people that were harmed in the war in Iraq and some of these other arguably illegal invasions the US has committed in the last several decades, they're overwhelmingly civilians. I mean, I've seen some research that says in Iraq, we're talking about like 90% of people who were hurt or killed are civilians. We're supposed to be not scathed in any way. I just see a comment from a student I see in the reading. It was shocking that there's approximately one gun for every 10 people on the planet. Yeah, I mean, that plays into this whole mentality, which actually was a point that I wanted to bring up too, what I think Al got at, but we did in a side way because of the research, the way it got at it a side way. But militarism is more than just like literally having a military and funding a military. It's an ideology. It's about how we approach things as if it's a war on things, right? In social issues, maybe a war on mentality isn't the most appropriate approach for them. So like, for instance, we can look at the militarization of policing, which is a huge part of the problem with policing today, that police have developed, and with authorization from highest level officials, a mentality that we are waging war on the citizens as opposed to protecting the citizens. Drastically different way of approaching your job. Even so much so, I mean, I know Al knows this, but I don't know if you guys all know this, but there's a program called 1033 that operates whereby police agencies can acquire military equipment and materials from the Department of Defense. So there are police agencies that own tanks, grenade launchers, all manner of things that, can you imagine invading your suburban neighborhood? Or there are even campus police that have this. I mean, can you imagine like a tank rolling into Barrie because like we have a problem? It's like, how is that possibly going to make people feel safer, you know?
And to back that up, what we're doing there, Congress won't touch the defense budget. Even when we went to $2.6 trillion for pandemic funding, we couldn't cut there were people advocating, can we just cut the budget, the Defense Department budget by 10%? Instead, what we do is we keep giving more money to them, to the point where they have all this excess equipment that then they give to police departments. They don't know what to do with it. So they give it away, and we taxpayers are paying for it. So what do you do with it? You give it to police departments so that they can become more militaristic.
Sorry, I muted for a second there because my dog started barking. She's still barking, I'm sorry, but no, exactly. I think it's how these all are woven together. I think it's a really great how you just put it that way. I don't know if anyone's had the chance to see, love him or hate him, Michael Moore's documentary, Where Should We Invade Next? It was from a few years ago. I used to actually use that in this class, and then now with resuming, it's kind of hard to watch a full documentary on this venue. But again, whether you like or hate Michael Moore as a documentarian, his approach is very interesting and very jives with what we're doing. What he basically says is, you know, the United States spends more in military than anyone else, and more than we need to for any sense of our safety. Like, we're out of control. But what if we were to shift that to other priorities, much like what Al was showing us? But he does it in this cutesy little way. So he's like, I'm going to invade, not literally, but like go to other countries and see some things they're doing differently than us, and say, what if we were to invade you and steal that idea and actually do that thing? So like, for instance, he goes to Italy and he interviews people who are like, we have like weeks off of paid like vacation, everybody. And it's like a 32-hour work week.
Yep.
And we actually get to go home for lunch every day, and like labor's rights kind of stuff. And then he goes to like Finland, and the schools are like amazing, like the best in the world. And the kids like don't go to school even like half the amount we go to, and they don't take standardized tests. And anyway, point being, he examines all these things. He's like, what if we shifted a little of our tax money that's going to military and supported workers' rights or healthcare or schools or whatever, all these things? We would have probably a healthier, happier society. And it wouldn't mean we have to go into more debt or raise any more money. We'd just be shifting little bits, you know? I think it's pretty well done if anyone gets a chance. I don't know if you've seen it, Al, but.
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, I would comment, the other thing that happens when you mentioned Finley, because I've done a presentation on the US compared to the Nordic countries. In those countries, the people participate in their democracy at much higher levels than we do in the United States, and they trust their governments more than we do in the United States. And they spend far less on the military. They focus on their people, they focus on their infrastructure, they focus on safety net security, so that the people there can then focus on creating new jobs, creating businesses, doing all those things that we don't do here.
Right. That's a good question I see from Mariah in the chat. What would the money go to if it didn't go to school or healthcare or military? Well, like Al showed the research, you know, green energy is another thing, but like the Michael Moore thing, he looks at, it goes to like, you know, people's social security, it goes to people's housing in some cases. In some places like Portugal, they've legalized all drugs. And so they've taken away the kind of functioning of policing and their monies in that budget from that kind of policing, if you will, to now you're just a recreational user. We're gonna leave you alone. You do you. If you have a substance abuse problem, they invested some of their monies that they shifted from these budgets into substance abuse treatment. So if you need help, we'll get you help. If you don't really need help and you're just a user, that's fine. You do you, whatever. There's another example, for instance, in Norway, in the prison systems, which, I mean, you see it, and it's like the prison looks like I don't even know how to describe it. It looks nice. It's like almost like more of a halfway house as we think of it. And the inmates actually have like jobs that are like legit, and they have freedoms, and they aren't treated in the way that like the nasty kind of like militaristic sort of way our prisons operate. And they're like, the recidivism rates are much, much lower. I mean, granted, there's some differences between some of these countries and us, so that's important to recognize. You can't make 100% comparisons, but still, like, there's lots of places where the monies could be shifted. The other example I think you all would like, since you're college students, is he goes to Slovakia and college is free. And so some of the monies that we use to support military is now shifted to being able to pay for college for everybody. Even if you're a US student who goes to live there, it's even free for you. So if you're willing to move to Slovakia, you're good to go. But like, we do that. Obviously, a lot of you guys are under huge debt, to be able to afford your education. So point being, even some of us who would like to go more extreme about cutting military budget, even if you just a little shift, you're starting to move it in the right direction. Good question.
I would like to add that in the article that we read, that they talked about warrior ethos, which means that the United States is using media and traditions to make soldiers and military something to celebrate. And I think that includes into what we're becoming a militia right now.
Yep. That's a great point. You go to other countries, you don't see military jets flying over for every every athletic event. You know, we just glamorize the military, and they, to the point where they don't even know how much they spend on promotion and advertising. But you can't have a military event here without having or a sporting event without having it become some honor to war.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, as I started in my costume, I'm a huge NBA fan. I love Miami Heat, but they have whole like apparel they wear that's camouflage or that's military garb. They do a whole like honor a soldier thing. None of that's honoring soldiers is a good thing. You know, I mean, I would never say we should not recognize somebody who served admirably and maybe is even traumatized from that service. Like that in and of itself, that's not, well, why does a whole league have
Can I
to do
make
that when
another
you
comment
could not
about
honor
where the money would go?
Exactly. And could you not honor somebody local doing community peace work? Of course you could. You're making a decision as a league that I'll prioritize this like warrior ethos that Melissa brought up, as opposed to like, let me bring up onto the stage somebody who did something amazing in helping the poor or whatever, like, but they don't do that, you know? And so I think that's pretty fascinating. And again, like Elle said, not something other countries do.
May I add something about the, you know, the question, you know, what would the money go to if it didn't go to school or healthcare or the military? It could also go back to you as taxpayers. We don't have to spend the money. We have huge deficits, and our taxing system is so inequitable now. And what we did, you know, 4 years ago with that tax cut, you know, has led to greater income inequality. We don't have to spend the money because our kids, my kids, your kids are going to be paying for this debt.
Right. And I mean, especially acutely now, you know, when we see people who are like struggling because businesses are closing or they're like a worker in the gig economy. I have a lot of friends who are actors and musicians who like, they basically, their income's dried up, you know. If we'd had a different economy that had invested in them more or even given the money back to them, they could have saved that money. They'd be in a different situation now, you know, and going forward, what would happen if everybody in America was able to have savings that they could at least go to in an emergency? Like in Miami, for instance, the #1 cause for homelessness is a major medical catastrophe. That rings really close to home to me, having had a pretty bad accident not too long ago. And I'm like, I don't, you know, most Americans are one paycheck away from that kind of thing if something awful happens. But what if that money was back to us and not being spent for these other things, you know? So I guess it's such a varied answer of where could it go, but almost anywhere seems like the better answer, which is, I guess, what the research seems to show.
Exactly.
I was thinking too, like when I talk about this, sometimes people are like, well, yeah, but you know, what about veterans? Like, do you guys anti-military people do not support veterans? So I know my answer to that, Al, but I'd love to hear your answer to that.
I'm the coordinator or a co-coordinator for our Veterans for Peace chapter. The way to support the veterans and the military people is to bring them home, to not have them die for no purpose, to take care of them. And instead what we're doing, and you'll hear about this, it's called the privatization of the Veterans Administration healthcare. It was the Choice Act, now the Mission Act, which is going to allow veterans to go outside of the VA health system to get care. It's been well documented that the VA health system is an excellent system of healthcare. With fully integrated electronic medical records, you know, that follow that veteran wherever she or he would go in the country or in the world. So we're not taking care of our veterans. Yes, we need to honor the troops. What we need to do, though, is keep in mind that $1.3 trillion, that doesn't go to the troops. It goes to military contractors, and it goes to Raytheon and to Boeing and to McDonnell Douglas and to these companies and to their executives and to their, you know, and now what we're even doing, we're talking about privatizing the VA healthcare system. We're privatizing war. by making a lot of the war through private contractors, but we're paying for it. So the direct answer to yes, we need to take care of the troops, keep them safe, give them opportunity, and bring them home.
Right. And that's how I answered it as well. I agree with you 100%, you know, and just that no one is saying like, let's abandon people who were served. In fact, I think we can do way better. We have an infrastructure, like Al said, for a good VA system, but it's not always been operated as well. And it's not nearly as funded as it should be. And you're talking about people who are coming home from atrocities, from deep traumas, from head injuries, from all kinds of things. We need to make sure we take care of those people, or else we have other social issues. Like there's a lot of research showing, like, for instance, higher rates of domestic violence against amongst returning soldiers, perhaps from PTSD or head injuries, traumas, etc. We would, if we invested in those people, we could prevent those other social issues, you know? So it's like, don't abandon that. That's not what anyone's saying. We're saying we just take them home and let's not invest in further you know, militarization. And the problem, and I'll mention this too, the problem is a lot of the places where the US has a military presence, we are not wanted. We have not been wanted. We definitely are still not wanted. And there's this whole blowback thing. There's a whole bunch of research on blowback about how the negative consequences of us occupying a space or invading a space last for a long time, you know, and in fact, you know, the war in Iraq traceable to the growing of the Taliban. It's like, we're not necessarily doing good in any respect. We may be creating seeds of bad, you know? So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but it gets me worked up.
What
I have a question.
Sure.
Why is the United States still like in other people's business? Like I thought that was one of the reasons why the first time the United Nations worked together, we didn't sign with them.
That's a great question. Because apparently we're addicted to it. And I mean that, I say that flippantly, but we've been doing this since World War II. Well, there's a book out now, The United States of War by David Vine, who notes, he looks at the history of the United States, and Howard Zinn did the same, similar kinds of things in his work. The United States has been at war in all but 11 years of our existence. We've been either invading Native Americans or Mexico or, you know, other people throughout the world. We just do that. Why do we do it? I don't know, but why don't we stop? And because we know that all it's doing is, as Dr. Finley mentioned, it's creating more enemies. We know from Dr. King's work, we know from everybody, violence doesn't bring about peace. Violence brings about more violence. So why don't we stop the violence?
There's an interesting article a few years ago that came out in the British Journal of Criminology, and they were trying to figure out, you know, a lot of the reasons why the US is a more violent society than almost anywhere else, and certainly at other comparable societies in the more highly developed world, if you want to use it that way, or the westernized nations or whatever. And the number one factor that this research came down to was that we're always have been such an individualistic society, and that individualist sort of rugged, I'll make my way, I'll fight my way through it, whatever, I'll defend myself and my family mentality has been enshrined in, like, our Constitution, for instance, and maybe in the Second Amendment and other places. We're very much about individual rights as opposed to a collectivist nation. So this was just arguing that's one of, this found that was the number one, but one of the reasons anyway is that our mentality is just different than other people. But it's so interesting if you look, like what Al was saying, like we've had this throughout all of our US history. We've dominated other people's land and told them, sorry, we get it, we're better using it than you, and we'll try to sell it back to you. It's like I stole your person and tried to sell it back to you. It's ridiculous, you know? Like, I mean, if you look at these things from afar, like, again, Al mentioned Howard Zinn. If you've never read Howard Zinn's People's History of America, great read as far as like what you might have learned in history class, what I learned in history class. and what actually was going on in US history, and how this like militaristic thread has like been such a common one in the US, but it's still a choice, right? It's still a way we opt to operate, and therefore the point being we can choose differently. I just want to say one more thing and see if anyone else has other questions, but years ago, so I mean, results may be different now, but let's just say, for example's sake, I was a high school teacher. I taught social studies, and I did an analysis of the 17 most adopted U.S. history high school books. So basically all that schools would possibly use as their textbook. And I wanted to see the degree to which they covered war, they covered peace. So I came up with some basic search terms, you know, war and peace, of course, but also key leaders in peacemaking like Gandhi, Jeanette Rankin, who opposed World War I and World War II, you know, just a bunch of things that I looked for in analyzing these books. It was perhaps not surprising. The entire way we teach history, at least if you teach history based on a textbook, which many teachers do, was all organized around war. It was like even the chapter headings were like the road to war, the US at war, the US wins the war, recovery from war. Like there was very, very little about peacemaking, peacetime, about what other people were doing when they weren't waging war. And it was like, well, if that's what we're teaching, no wonder we continue to have this mentality, because we're not teaching people to question if that's a normal state of affairs. It was only like 2 of the books even mentioned like Gandhi, who was like obviously a peacemaker. One I think even mentioned Jeanette Rankin, even though she was remarkably opposing to World War I and II, and a female in the Senate at a time where there weren't any. So like, this seems like that's worthy of a mention, you know? So it reiterated to me that part of the problem is that we pass on to other generations that this is normal.
One other thing we've done, and not we, I haven't done any.
Neither.
There are organizations such as Nonviolent Peace Force, Christian Peacemakers teams that go in as unarmed civilian. They provide unarmed civilian protection. I mention this because in parts of Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world, in South Asia and Myanmar and so on, these are folks who are unarmed, and they protect people. They protect women as they're going to get water from people who want to do them harm. And they are incredibly successful that people won't attack unarmed people. Yes, sometimes they will, but by and large, they don't respond with violence when they know people aren't going to confer violence upon them. When I think about this defense budget, we know that directly it's somewhere around 3 million people. It's 6 million people nationwide through Department of Defense, all the contractors, all the civilians, employees, all of the National Guard, all of that stuff. Imagine if we said, let's cut that. Let's cut it in half, and we'll still spend far more than the rest of the world. Let's take those 1 million of those people, and let's have them become unarmed civilian protectors. Let's train them in peace building. Let's train them in truth and reconciliation squads. Let's have them become the force we send in when there's violence around the world, rather than thinking we have to use armed military or we want to provoke it with armed military people. There are alternatives to militarism that we're not exploring very well.
Absolutely. And, you know, even investments in Peace Corps and AmeriCorps and other like peacemaking projects that are service, right? So like, yeah, I'm sure you guys have all heard of the Peace Corps, but like it doesn't get nearly the attention or the funding that the military does, but it was intended when John F. Kennedy created it to be an alternative way to serve your country. And so could we elevate that? Of course we could. And that could be, you know, again, sending people maybe to countries to do good humanitarian work, although there's some dubiousness about some of those projects too, about how effective they are and whatever, but potentially. And even more so the AmeriCorps program, which is basically like the domestic Peace Corps, which is saying you will get, you know, stipends, you will get some resources if you sign up to do this to help your community. that would be an awesome, better investment in so many respects, you know? I don't know, but I don't want myself to, I don't monopolize the questions and whatnot. Does anyone, other students have questions? Again, feel free to chat them if it's more comfortable to you, or to unmute yourself and say them. There's a lot here. I hope I hope you found it really interesting, but there may be questions you have, and don't be silent about them. Okay. I feel like you probably do, but it's okay. If you want to follow up later independently with me or with Al, you have Al's contact information too. I'm looking at my notes as you were speaking, Al, to make sure I asked or talked about all the things that came up to me. The one other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important here is how much fraud and corruption happens within the military budget. And how I have a personal friend who served in Iraq, and she's like, oh my goodness, like the amount of equipment that we had there that we didn't use, and then even more so, we just left once I came home, like it was still there. And as far as I know, these things are still there, taking up space, environmentally degrading the area. And so that's something the students also read about too, was like one of the costs of war is an environmental cost that we're still paying for all these decades later from Vietnam or other places. And so my friend is such a testament to like that fraud cost, or that, you know, that legacy effect. So I think that's a really important piece.
Along that line, the lasting effect of war, just a little tidbit, the United Nations estimated that with the landmines, and the world has now outlawed landmines. Well, are we still using them? Probably, yes. But let's make an effort at getting rid of chemical weapons and nuclear, and not using nuclear weapons, everyone but our country. And nerve gas and so on. Landmines, the United Nations estimated in Southeast Asia, it will take 1,100 years to dismantle all of the landmines that are still there. And there are still hundreds of thousands of people getting injured from those landmines from 50 and 60 years ago. And they'll be there not quite forever, but 1,100 years is a long, long time.
It's horrifying. And the United States was a leader in using landmines, but has not been a leader in ratifying these international treaties to end them. And even while we may not actively be placing any more, producing them, a lot of the ones that are there are ours that we did place. And so part of the landmine, there's an international landmine treaty ban that says countries should be responsible to go clean that up. Like, you shouldn't have civilians coming upon an old landmine. You should have to go in and clean up your mess, basically. And the United States has not been cooperative with that. And so, you know, that's disturbing. It's like, you know, some of this, again, 50, 60 years ago, it's long since passed. You're talking about innocent people always, who had nothing to do with anything about that conflict, who are injured or dying from something that we are responsible for doing, you know. It's, yeah. And in some of my other classes, not this one particularly, but we have looked at some of the international human rights treaties and how the United States is way behind in looking at these kinds of things from human rights perspective and enforcing them from human rights perspective. And even though I think, again, previously to, I guess, a little bit of Melissa's comment, the United Nations is certainly an imperfect entity. At least it's a start of a global effort to address some of these things. And the United States has a really dubious and mixed record with it all.
Yep.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
One last pitch, if I may.
Please do.
If you are, as individuals or collectively, if you are involved in various social justice causes, peace causes, justice causes, whatever it might be, I encourage you to consider having your organization join this Florida Peace and Justice Alliance, because we've got a lot of organizations wanting to join it so that we can become more effective. If we're going out to lobby for something, or if there's an action in Miami and you want folks to know about it, folks in Jacksonville to know about it, that's a vehicle through which you can get your message out.
Absolutely. And you can contact Al if you saved his contact information, or me, and I can put you in touch with Al. I'm thinking, I mean, mostly, maybe you guys don't all know, I don't know. Melissa is the president of our club called Ignite, which is mostly sociology and criminology majors, but not exclusive to be, doesn't have to be, but I think a lot of you are anyway. But I think it could be right up Ignite's alley to be a party of the Florida Peace and Justice Alliance, because then as there are, like, again, actions or, you know, petitions or whatever might be happening, we can, from Barry University, support that also.
And we need young people to join. We need your help.
Absolutely. It's funny because I'm part of the Peace and Justice Studies Association that I share with you guys, our conference, online conference, whatever. And we go to these conferences and it is overwhelming. Like, I'm a young person there and I'm like, I'm 47. Like, this is not how this needs to be. We need to attract younger people who care about these issues to get involved in these movements, because, like, if I'm the youth of it, it ain't working. You know, and that's great. There's so many great older folks that have wisdom and experience, so that we don't want to lose that either, but we need both sides. We need the wisdom and the experience and the background and the energy and the new, and I want to learn from you kind of thing. So we encourage you all to get in contact with me or Al or both of us or whatever. Seeing, I guess, no other further comments or questions, I guess I go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you so much, Al. That was amazing. Perfect. I think it aligned. I hope they saw it, but I saw how it aligned really nicely with what I asked them to read. So that makes my little heart happy.
All right.
We appreciate you.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be here.
Awesome. And Al put me in touch with Greta, who works with World Beyond War, who's going to speak again next week about some of the other alternatives to war, but also about community organizing and how we as individuals who, like we were talking about theory earlier, like more the proletariat, us of us without a lot of political power, can actually be a huge part of the change. So she's also going to get us a little bit more into the social and environmental costs of war, which we mentioned today, but she's got more to say about that. So I think these 2 weeks are going to be really nice together. And I'm so grateful for Al for putting me in touch with her also.
Greta is incredible.
Awesome. All right, well then I wish you all a good night. Thank you again, Al. We really appreciate you. And reiterating to my students, you don't have anything you have to do for me for next week. Just show up for next week's class, but make sure you're picking away at your assignments that you have out there for, you know, a couple weeks down the road. And all right, good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.